Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we have a Porsche GT3 comparison. We're currently sitting in a 2004 996.2 GT3, and we'll be comparing this to a 2011 997.2 GT3. So these two cars are the facelifted versions of the first two generations of the GT3. The 996.2 was actually the first GT3 that ever came to the United States. We did not get the 996.1 back in 1999. In terms of market value today, a mid to higher mileage 996.2 GT3 still goes for almost $100,000. I remember it wasn't that long ago, maybe 5 years ago, when you can get one of these cars with higher mileage and some track time for under $60,000. I even saw some in the low 50s. But nowadays, that is just not going to happen. These cars, as well as the 997s, have really just shot up in value. So with a similar level of condition and mileage and number of owners and so forth, between these two cars, we're talking around $100,000 versus $170,000. So is the 50 to 75% increase in price translate well to how these cars drive? Is the 997.2 really that much better of a driving experience? So let's talk about specs. This 996.2 is powered by a 3.6 liter Metzger naturally aspirated flat six engine. It makes about 380 horsepower, and this car, when stock, weighs a little over 3,000 pounds. This particular one, owned by my friend Yitao, is not stock. It has a number of track-focused mods, including Moton shocks, lowering springs, a very lightweight exhaust out back. It is incredibly loud and drony, so hopefully my audio quality isn't affected too much here. We have these beautiful bucket seats. We're on stock wheels with Michelin PS4S tires, a modern tire compound. I'll put the full list of mods in the video description, but this spec should be a little under 3,000 pounds. I did review this on the channel once before, but as I like to say, you never really know how a car truly drives until you've driven it at least twice. Now, real quick before we fire this thing up, this interior is bare bones. I mean, I've never been a biggest fan of the 996 generation interior in general. I think these cars actually look a lot better from the outside than they do from inside, even with the fried egg headlamps. A lot of blank buttons here on the center console. Kind of a rounded, smooth design to a lot of the interior pieces. Most of the buttons in this car are oval. It's not an interior that ages particularly well, in my opinion. And once we hop into that 997, you'll see just how big of a step forward Porsche took. Anyways, let's fire this bad boy up and see how it drives. Oh yeah. It's loud, it's rattly. This GT3 Cup clutch is very, very noisy. The clutch is so heavy. The roll bar back there has got a squeak as well. Hopefully the audio's not unbearable. That Metzger flat six, 3.6 liters and 8,000 plus RPMs of glory. It sounds so good. Excellent throttle response. It's so direct. The handling balance of this car is very tricky. On turn-in, it really does not like the fact that there's not a whole lot of weight over the nose. And when you get back on the throttle, if you're too aggressive, the car understeers. You have to be a lot more progressive with your right foot. It's that classic rear-engine, rear-wheel drive driving dynamic, and if you're not used to it, the 996 GT3 will be a tricky car for you to get the hang of. Let's see about this straight line performance though. You really can't beat that sound. It's just pure motorsport. Brake pedal feels pretty good. plasticky action to it. It's not the most mechanical or direct shifter in the world. The throws are a little bit long. There's some lateral slop. But it is a very easy shifter to use, at least. So much feedback through this hydraulic steering rack, but I wish it loaded up a little bit more in the corners. It feels a little bit light. Now, part of that is just because there's no weight over the front axle. This car basically feels like a pendulum. Kind of dancing all over the place. The suspension really not meant for a bumpy canyon road. It's much more of a motorsport focused damper, but it's coping here. What a car, the 996.2 GT3. It's raw, it's visceral, it is unforgiving. It requires really a lot from the driver. The clutch is heavy, this car is stiff. I mean, it's not an easy car to putt around in, that's for sure. And then once you get going, once you start driving this thing a lot harder, that's when it rears its, I won't call it an ugly head, it's just, it's different. It's rear engine, rear wheel drive with very little weight over the front axle. You have to really know what you're doing in terms of weight transfer to drive this car properly. And I will say I am getting the hang of it, I think, the second time that I'm driving it. One thing I'm realizing is that I can't use the throttle pedal as an on-off switch. I have to be very progressive and really squeeze the throttle coming out of corners to prevent too sudden of a weight transfer. You want to keep some weight over that front axle. You don't want to immediately shift the load to the rear axle, because you literally will feel this car tilt back like it wants to do a mini wheelie. It really rewards smooth inputs, but even when you do that, it's not the most intuitive car to drive. All right, let's finish up the drive here. Hope we have a clear road ahead, and then hop into that 997.2. These dampers are not happy about how bumpy this road is. There's a reasonable amount of mid-range torque, but this engine really wants to be above 5,000 RPM. That's where it's happy. Obviously no traction or stability control in this car. It does have ABS. To be on your game to drive this thing hard. Sometimes I feel like the brake pedal could use a little bit more. It could give me a little bit more confidence. Very easy to heel toe with the floor mounted gas pedal. And again, with that throttle response, this engine is perfect. I wouldn't change anything about it. And you know what? 380 horsepower still feels like a healthy amount in a sub 3,000 pound car. I mean, that's plenty of power. Especially given how raw this car is. Oh man, what a car. I have a newfound appreciation for the .2 996. I think the first time I drove it, I didn't really, I'll admit, do it justice, because I was driving it as if it was a 997 or later generation GT3, and as most of you probably know, at least you Porsche fanatics out there, with each generation, they dialed out more and more of that rear engine feel. This one doesn't try to do that at all. It is a rear engine car in all of its glory, and you have to know what that means. Pretty long gearing, but this car has enough power to back that gearing up, in my opinion. So yeah, from outside and inside, this might not feel and look like a six-figure car, but the way it drives, the way it sounds, the emotion it evokes, worth the money, in my opinion. Is the 997.2 really that much better though? Let's find out. All right, we're now in the 2011 997.2 GT3. My friend Yo recently picked this up. He's always been a big Porsche fanatic, owned a Cayman R in the past, and has a 996 Carrera as well. This car is much newer feeling than the 996, and I say that in a good way. A lot of times, you know, with older, more classic cars, you kind of want that older feel, that feeling that you just hopped into a time machine. I can say that with the 996, I don't really get that sensation in a positive way. Everything feels like it was just built in an era that was just a little bit off in terms of design, but not here. This interior feels dated, yes, but I wouldn't call it outdated. This has a much cleaner design that I think will withstand the test of time much better. This still very much feels like a 911. The seating position, you can get it really nice and low. We're just on the sport seats, not the buckets. I'm actually sitting a little bit lower and more reclined, which is a lot more comfortable for me. Of course, I used to own a 997.1 base Carrera, and this feels right at home. So in terms of specs, this is powered by a 3.8 liter version of the Metzger engine that produces 435 horsepower. It revs a bit higher. Redline appears to be 8,400 RPM. There's Yo driving Yitao's 996. This car weighs a little bit under 3,100 pounds, so a little bit heavier than a 996.2. This car still has hydraulic steering, but we do have traction and stability control. Yo has actually done quite a few things to this car, or I should say the previous owner did. We have an Akrapovic muffler, RS 4.0 headers and cats, RS 4.0 flywheel, Öhlins road and track coilovers, which are more street-focused coilover compared to the Motons in that 996.2. But we do have monoball links replacing all these stock rubber bushings. I'll put the full list of mods in the video description. Let's drive this thing and see if it's worth the extra, say, $70,000. Startup is a lot more mild. This car did come with PASM adaptive dampers, but obviously we have fixed Öhlins suspension now. I'll turn on the sport mode for enhanced throttle response. Still have quite a bit of clutch chatter. First thing I'm noticing, much tighter shifter linkage. It feels a lot less cheap and floppy compared to the 996. This feels a lot more bolt action rifle, if you will. I really like this shifter. This has a much quicker steering ratio. I can place the front end of this car into these corners with a lot less steering input. Feels way quicker in a straight line. An extra 55 horsepower feels like more than that. This engine actually doesn't sound quite as insane as a 996, but I think that comes down to the exhaust. And this car has a more refined cabin in terms of NVH. I can still hear what the tires and engine are doing, no problem, but it's not quite as raw. And you know what? I actually welcome that. Still get all the wonderful steering feel through this hydraulic rack. The shifter is far superior. Roll into it. Really long gearing here as well. Better brakes. Got some 6-piston calipers. Yeah, more braking confidence in a 997. still have amazing throttle response. It's drive-by-wire, but you know what? It feels like a cable throttle. Wow. The turn-in of this car feels a lot sharper. I don't have to be as judicious with my right foot on corner exit. The car still grips. It doesn't do that kind of mini wheelie that the 996 tends to do. Definitely feels less rear engine than the 996. This front end is definitely superior. Now, granted, we are on Michelin Cup 2 tires, which are much stickier than the PS4S and the 996, but I don't think that's the only difference here. This is a much easier car to hop into and drive quickly. Much easier. The steering is still talkative, but it's not sort of darting around every time I touch that gas pedal. Wow, this car is good. 997.2 GT3. One of the all-time great driving experiences. One of the best cars I've driven. Love this shifter. It's so direct, it's so notchy. Oh, wow. This front end is far superior. I don't feel like I have to be super intentional with my weight transfer. And you know what? I like that better. It feels more balanced. Despite the fact that I was getting used to that 996's handling dynamics, this just feels like it's engineered better. It's engineered more optimally, I should say, for cornering. I mean, look at that. It's helped by the quicker steering ratio, sure, but something about the front end geometry of the 997 generation is just, it's much more my cup of tea. This long gearing can be a little bit frustrating on a tight road. I wish we were able to wring the engine out a little bit more frequently. I actually think the gearing in this feels perhaps longer than the gearing in the 996.2. Damn, what a car! The 997.2 GT3, it still captures most of the rawness of the 996 that you want, but with a lot less of the quirky handling dynamics. It still feels rear engine, don't get me wrong, but the front end on this car is just way more pinned. All right, one more straight line pull, then we'll wrap up. Like the high RPM sound of that particular 996.2 better than this car. That comes down to the exhaust. This is much more livable in every way, actually. Not just the inherent build quality and design and low NVH levels of the 997 generation versus the 996, but also the exhaust on this one is quieter, the seat's a lot more comfortable, and these Öhlins road and track coilovers, they are the gold standard for a reason. They're comfortable and they give you better handling than stock. That's how I would sum up Öhlins road and track for basically every platform. This really is a more OEM plus type of approach to modifying an old GT3. It's a car that you can enjoy on a canyon road or on a racetrack. Whereas that 996, the way it's set up and just due to the inherent rawness of that platform, it's way less forgiving in every sense of the word. The way it handles, the way it rides, the way it feels just sitting in it. But a lot of car enthusiasts tend to correlate old school rawness with fun. But I would argue that the 997 carries all of the rawness that you want, or at least that I want from the 996. The talkative steering, the fact that you feel everything through the seat and through your fingertips and through your feet. while offering a level of refinement that is just sorely missing in the 996. This is a car that puts as big of a grin on my face when I drive it hard, but at the end of the day, I can drive this car home in comfort. So I actually can't believe I'm saying this, but I think this is worth the extra, say, $60,000, $70,000 if that's what you're looking for. If you're looking for a more dual-purpose machine that is still incredibly fun to drive and has an actually much higher performance limit than the 996, it starts to make that 60 to 70 grand feel worth it, doesn't it? And this car is actually more rare, so it might actually hold value better than a 996 as well. I think around 1,000 of those 996.2s were brought to the US, whereas a 997.2 less than 800. So let me know what you think of these two generations of the 911 GT3. If you've driven both, do you agree with my assessment that the 997.2 dials out a lot of that quirky rear engine handling dynamic? And do you agree that the extra refinement of this car doesn't take away any of the driving pleasure that you get with the 996? A big thank you to Yitao and Yo for letting me drive their cars. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.